Welcome to the Empowered Living Zone, where you can create the life you crave. With me, Dr. A, as a psychologist for over 30 years, a transformational life coach, and an expert in self-empowerment, my life's work has been inspired by the beautifully powerful resilience of the human spirit. We will share stories and successes of people who have not only overcome personal adversity, but have used their traumas and hardships courageously as a springboard into greatness. Create positive transformational shifts on your way to achieving phenomenal success. Get ready to level up as you move beyond the challenging terrain of your life's journey into the empowered living zone. Ignited by spirit, fueled by purpose, and guided by vision, the Empowered Living Zone show starts now. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. A, and you are listening to the Empowered Living Zone on Transformation Talk Radio. And with me today is my guest, Dr. Pat Baccili. Dr. Pat is an international award-winning talk radio show host, TV commentator, certified career belief coach, dynamic seminar leader, and inspirational speaker, award-winning author and researcher, and the CEO and owner of her successful inspirational company, Unlimited Possibilities Now. Dr. Pat is well respected in her various roles in the human potential field, and she has received numerous awards for her empowering message on the radio. I'm deeply grateful to have and honored to have Dr. Pat with me today. Welcome, Dr. Pat.
Thank you so much. The feeling is mutual. I always look forward to the conversations we're about to have because you and I have the same goal. You know, I believe we have the same goal, and that is to inspire, uplift, and in your words, really get to that empowerment zone, get to that place where people can have a new sense of freedom.
Yes. And we're going to start today. I often start this way. I really believe, Dr. Pat, that this is really important information. So I have a tendency to do a little bit of review because I want the listeners to really get this, because this is important. This is life. You know, this is life. As I said, it's not fluff, it's life. And, you know, when our listeners get these concepts down, it can change their lives in very dramatic and successful ways. So let's start with a little bit of a review. Last week, we talked about essence. And essence, what is essence? Essence is basically our personal connection with universal intelligence. Well, that sounds really fancy. What does it really mean? Exactly, right? Well, I came up with a great metaphor. Think about it this way, Dr. Pat. You think about all our electronic devices or appliances we have in our household. You know, we got to plug them into the outlet so that we get plugged into the electrical grid so that we have power, right? Well, essence is exactly the same way. It operates in the same kind of way. We need to plug into our essence. We need to plug into that part of us to access power, access unlimited wisdom to create the lives that we want to create. What's also really important about essence is that essence is untouched by our humanness. It's untouched by adversity, tragedy. It's untouched by programming and things that we learn as humans. And this is also really important because it's pure intelligence. It's pure creativity. It's indestructible. Now, our ego self often experiences essence as that intuition, our gut feelings, that feeling, that deep wisdom that we have in our deep core being. And that's really important. We also discussed how we access it. How do we plug into it? How do we strengthen it? And actually, it's very simple. It may not be easy because I think as I said before, we're kind of in that manic society, right? It's very simple. Number one is learning how to slow down, learning how to get off that hamster wheel and learning to just slow down and listen because it is always there for you. It's also important to learn how to quiet your mind. You know, there are definitely different kinds of strategies. Probably the most powerful strategies for learning how to quiet your mind is a meditative practice. Prayer will often help quiet your mind and kind of get connected to that deep wisdom within you. And also just practicing, closing the world out, going deep within your being and just being silent and just noticing, what do you notice? What do you hear? And paying attention to that voice. And sometimes people have a hard time being still. So there are other options. Being in nature is important. It basically being in nature just intuitively, kind of stimulates that sense of connection, like connection to everything and all things. And that can open us up to that voice of wisdom in us. Even deep breathing is something that can be really helpful, because what it does is it calms the nervous system, and it tells the ego, hey, everything's good. Everything's good. And there's kind of a letdown. There's an allowance. And a lot of times that voice of wisdom will come through when we have, we let down. Something I want to share with the readers is sometimes these ideas seem just kind of out there. And what I want the listeners to hear is that we already do this intuitively, and we just may not be aware of it. There's many times, I'm sure you've had this experience, Dr. Pat. As a matter of fact, I know you described it when you were in a little bit of a panic around the trademarking stuff. We get really crazy in our head, and there's this sense of urgency and pressure. And then we take a deep breath, and we go inside deep in us. We try our best to quiet our minds, and we go in either usually in our heart space or our gut or somewhere in between, and we just listen. And often the answer's there. So people know how to do this. They just don't realize that they're doing it. And sometimes people get confused. What voice am I hearing? And I just want to point out there are very surefire ways to know, am I hearing the voice of my essence, or am I hearing the voice of my ego? They're very clear. If you're in essence, there's an ease, there's a calmness, there's a peacefulness, there's an openness, there's a trust, there's a curiosity. When we're in our ego mind, when we're hearing the voice of our ego, there is a preoccupation with safety. Am I okay? Predictability. There's a lot of judgment. There's the critic. The critic is alive and well in that voice. There's fear. There's defensiveness. There's resistance. There's this efforting. So these are the surefire ways of telling when you're really in essence. And I'm kind of curious about your experience with essence, Dr. Pat. What would you like to say about it?
Well, I would like to say, and first of all, thank you for that beautiful, beautiful recap. But I love when you do that, because it's not just a recap. It's, Gloria Steinem said something to me once when I asked her a question about what she had done in the world. And she said, you know what, we stand on the shoulders of all that have come before. And that's what you do every time you present, let's call it a recap. You're telling folks this is where we were and setting the stage for them to rethink it and then look at it. For me, what you've described is a way of life now. And when I don't do that, or when I don't call on the wisdom of essence in the way you described it, anyway, that is, then I end up in a pothole or a ditch or someplace on a deserted island with no water. And the reason I say that is maybe I don't physically, but metaphorically, energetically, spiritually, I do. And I don't get the answer, because, to quote Frank Benson, fear is the little mind killer. And so often we don't know that the way to overcome so many things in life, including ourselves, is to do what Einstein said. Don't try to solve it at the problem it was created. And what he meant is exactly what you shared. It's our go-to has to be essence. And when I do that today, I don't have a worry in the world.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it is.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Now we need to convince our listeners of this. And there's no convincing. It's really living it. When you live it, you realize the power of this. You absolutely do. And I love what you said. I think it's really important. Einstein obviously was a genius. And one of the things that he did say is you cannot solve a problem on the level of which it was created. And when we create problems in our mind, we can't solve them from our mind. We have to go into that deep wisdom. And so I think that's really critical and important.
Yeah.
You know what we're doing? We're going to go ahead and take a quick break. We did that recap. We're going to take a quick break. And when we get back, we are going to tackle ego and what that means and what it means in terms of self-empowerment. So we'll take a quick break now. We are back on the Empowered Living Zone with me, Dr. A, and Dr. Pat, and we are going to move on to talk about ego. A lot of listeners are probably well acquainted with ego, and I will tell you, Dr. Pat, I think ego gets a bad rap. I'm going to tell you that right up front. If it's funny, if you Google ego, you will find these memes, and I got a kick out of them. A lot of memes such as "ego is the enemy." Or "death to the ego" was another one I saw. You want to hear something ironic, Dr. Pat? I had to chuckle when I read these memes because the memes themselves are ego.
Yeah, that is so true. What?
Anyway, let's get into this. You know,
I used to think ego was because I was obsessed with buying sports cars. But then I realized, no, that's not it. I really love sports cars and Harley Davidsons.
That's funny. Well, and that's usually when people hear the word ego, that's usually what they believe, Dr. Pat, is people refer to ego. It's a bad thing. People have big egos, you know, and that's as far as it goes. And that's not really what I mean by ego. You know, ego is actually a really important part of who we are as a human being. It's a necessary part. You know, it'd be like walking around without a heart or a liver. You know, we definitely need this. This is what makes us human. And yet at the same time, even though this is really, really important, a lot of people don't really know what it is. They don't understand it. It's complicated. And so ego is a very complex, multifaceted aspect of our psychological anatomy. So just like we have in our biological anatomy, we have all these parts that makes us work from a physical perspective or a biological perspective. Ego is our psychological anatomy that helps us work from a psychological perspective or from a human perspective. And ego is basically, it's our conscious mind. So what that basically means, it's the part of our mind that has awareness. It's aware. And it's often the part that we identify as us, like I or me or myself. That is the part of our mind that we identify with. That's often what is referred to as ego. And a lot of times what people think about is the sum total of the ego experience is what we would probably identify as our identity or our personality. So all of it together is who we think we are. Yeah. And what's most important, so basically when we look at the ego, from my perspective, the ego kind of has two jobs. One job, and we'll get into this because this is the job that gets the ego into a lot of trouble. I'm just going to let you know right off the bat. One job is to maintain well-being. So the ego is on constant alert around safety. Now, in today's world, and you know, back in prehistoric times, safety was about physical safety. Am I going to be eaten by this dinosaur or the saber-toothed tiger? We don't have that issue today. So now it's translated into safety around emotional safety, safety around identity. Is my identity being threatened? Is my well-being being threatened? And egos, that's one of its jobs, is anytime information is coming in, it's going to assess. Am I okay? Am I not okay? So that's a really important part of the job. Now, with regard to self-empowerment, the ego also has a really important job. And that is, the ego is responsible for navigating the external reality. Essence doesn't navigate the external reality. Essence is not in the external reality. Essence is just consciousness. It's pure consciousness. It's a wisdom. It's intelligence. It's creative, but it's not in the external reality. So without ego, we would not be able to navigate our realities. So in this regard, I mean, one of the things to kind of consider, it's like ego is almost like a tour guide. You know, it knows the lay of the land. It knows how, you know, it has a sense of how everything works. And so it can be the tour guide to essence. It can bring that information and it can take that information out into the world as well. So in that regard, ego is really important because it helps kind of the interface. It helps navigate the external reality. And, if we didn't have an ego, what would we be doing? We wouldn't be able to do that. So that's really important. So ego is the vehicle. It is the mechanism that takes our awareness, it takes our experience, whether it's coming from divine intelligence or our mind, and it brings it out into the external world. And this is important.
I wish I would have been there in 1926. Now, I don't wish I would have been in 1926. It's a horrible time for women. But if I were in 1926 and I was on the other end of receiving Freud's talk on psychoanalysis, where he described the ego, it would make perfect sense. Because every time I mention Freud, I get emails. No, I'm not a student of Freud. I look at what Freud says in the context. Because if you think about what Freud's talking about, what he does is he breaks it down beautifully. Now, of course, things have been argued, disputed. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Hello. How do you call something hierarchy of needs and then discount ego? You can't. Wait, needs. Oh, needs without ego. What is that? That's an illusion. And so when you think about this, you have to ask yourself, how did we get so odd with ego? How did we decide we were going to get in a boxing ring with ego and try to beat ego down? Well, how did we do it? That's our ego doing it, but not the ego we talk about. So what you're talking about is something we don't talk about. When I look at scholars describe the importance of this thing we call ego, one misconception, and I wish you would talk to this, is that once you get an ego, it doesn't change. That is so wrong. Ego changes, right? It changes. It changes with development. But what you're talking about is something that has been almost made to be not wanted, because it's almost been made to be not necessary. And that is not at all what I heard you just say.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I have to tell you this funny story. So I have a friend, and she is a therapist, and she's a little bit older than I am. And her partner was very, very much into spirituality. Her life was just completely structured and focused on spirituality. And the friend of mine, it made me really laugh because she picked up one of her partner's books and she saw ego death. And she literally took the book and threw it across the room because it freaked her out so much. Because what do you mean ego death? What does that mean? It's like, if my ego's dead, I'm dead? That's who I am, right? And so that's a great question. I'm not sure where this came from and what happened, but this is often at the core of a lot of spiritual experiences. They talk about spiritual bypass. They talk about, you can't do a workaround. You cannot do a workaround on your humanness, and the beauty of it is that our humanness is a very important part of this equation. So there's no reason to vilify it at all.
I don't even I'm sorry. I know this is not part of what we're going to talk about, but I got to stay with you on this for a minute, because I hope you do a show on this as we move forward. I don't understand where we got the information that separates ego and spirituality. Think about the masters that walked the earth. Everybody from Jesus to Buddha, it doesn't matter. Everyone, they show their humanity. I mean, I don't think anybody shows humanity better than Buddha. Or I will say Buddha can be a little bit of a downer sometimes. Don't email me on this. Just read about Buddha. Okay. But what I'm saying is you have different agencies. My table tennis partner is, Hindu. What is that? 98 million deities, right? So I don't understand why we do that, why we've created a gap. But that's why you're here. Because when you talk about, and I hear you talk about the empowered living zone, you're not leaving anything out.
Right.
Am I right?
Right. Correct.
Because why would we?
Right. Yeah, it would be like a bird with one wing or a fish with one fin, right?
Coach.
He
Yeah.
don't go anywhere. He just comes
Down.
right?
Yeah.
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 It is an interesting concept. I'm not sure what happened. And ironically, even the conversation when you were talking about the ego being in the boxing ring with the ego, that is ego.
That is ego that gets us in the boxing ring with ego. But some people say we got it from Freud. No, we didn't get it from Freud. I mean, we got the distinction from Freud. Freud is very clear. There's a super ego, there's an id, and there's a bunch of other things. And you go through, and the bottom line is what he was trying to do is he was trying to describe the dynamics of the mind. What you're doing, what's different between Freud and even Jung is you're describing not just the dynamics of the mind, but the dynamics of human nature, not just mind, but it's mind, it's the body, it's our emotions, and it's spirituality. And there are a few more that I won't go into. But you see, how do we ever get to change? You see, this great thing about Freud, about having the ego have the ability to change. Well, how are we going to change it? How do we know what to change it to if we don't have this blueprint that you're describing for us? It's almost as if we feel powerless. That's not empowerment.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right?
Right.
Sorry,
right.
I just had to just go off on that a little bit because if it wasn't for my ego, I don't know if I'd be here talking to you today.
Probably say the same, Dr.
Yeah.
I would say exactly the same.
Okay. Now, look, ego is like the term ego has gotten to be like the term narcissism and narcissist. We just throw that thing around. And what I think you and I are trying to say today, before you jump on the bandwagon about something, try to understand it. Because yes, there are inflated egos, there are super egos. But that doesn't mean we have an egoic personality disorder.
Right. And it doesn't mean that the mission then is to get rid of it, to extricate it in some kind of way, because that's not going to do us any good either.
Yeah.
I think what's important about this, Dr. Pat, is to recognize what is the ego's place in self-empowerment. And really what the ego's place is to be in service to that deep wisdom. What you will find, and this is probably what people are speaking to when they're saying death to the ego, is that sometimes the ego can get a little out of control. It can get a little power hungry, and it can create experiences that create a lot of suffering. And that's what people are trying to escape from. But if ego is where it's supposed to be, which is in partnership with essence and in service with essence, then everything's golden. Everything works. And we'll talk more about that. We're going to take a short break, and when we get back, we'll talk more about ego and its role in self-empowerment. Okay, we're back on the Empowered Living Zone with me, Dr. A, and Dr. Pat. And before we begin or continue to talk about ego, if anybody would like the opportunity to work with me or would like to hear more information about empowered living and psycho-spiritual transformational life coaching, you can reach me through my website at www.empoweredlivingcoaching.com. That's www.empoweredlivingcoaching.com. All right, let's get back to this whole discussion on ego and how it's gotten a bad rap. One of the things that I want to talk about a little bit, Dr. Pat, and this is actually, I think, is also a really critical point about ego, is recognizing that ego is the awareness behind experience. It is not the experience itself. And so I want to make a distinction. There is mind and there is ego. Ego is a part of mind, but they're not the same thing. So the mind is the thing that basically processes information, takes information in, and information comes in through our body, through our senses, and it makes meaning of that information. And once, it creates a story, it creates a narrative about the information, and then the information and that narrative impels us. It creates an emotion. It creates an emotional response to the story, which impels us into some form of action. That is mind. Okay. Ego is the experience of that. And I really want to make sure our listeners hear that, because this is what is really critical to self-empowerment, Dr. Pat, is recognizing that there is a separation between the awareness of an experience and the experience itself. And I'll talk about why that's important. I don't know if you'd like to add something to that.
Just quick. I mean, let's just use a real easy example, because where ego can get you into trouble or get itself into trouble is especially around the idea of confidence or self-esteem. And the reason I bring this up is because this is the area that hits touch points across the board, including essence. And what I mean by that is, look, your ego may come into play when you receive criticism at work. Let's just use that, because that's now an obsession. Criticism at work. We've always gotten criticism at work. It doesn't matter who you are. And perhaps maybe more criticism at work at Boeing. Maybe we wouldn't have had a bolt that comes off a door. I don't know. But you see, I think we tiptoe and we dance around this so much, we're afraid. And so when we get criticism, and I'm going to say criticism because feedback doesn't work here, but if we get it, the ego may help you protect, right? Your self-esteem, maintain a positive self-image. See, that's the positive side of ego, but we don't talk about that enough. We'll say, oh, well, now my self-esteem is... No, the ego allows us that experience, to call upon experience that remind us of who we really are. But it's very difficult to do it if you don't have essence in the equation, I don't think.
I agree. I think that that's something that we have to kind of dip into. And, that's a great example. And I would even take it a little bit further, Dr. Pat, in thinking about our current culture and the whole hating culture, that people are really hard on each other with social media platforms. And what happens is, talk about an activation here. When you have a threat, somebody is supposedly calling you out on something, the ego's response to that is to go, oh no, I'm not safe, I'm not okay. And then there's going to be a series of things that follow that. When in reality, it's recognizing that your experience of well-being is independent of what is actually coming toward you, unless it is the saber-toothed tiger, of course. Right.
But we all have personal experiences with this. You have personal experience with this too.
Absolutely. And I would like to make this real and more palpable for our listeners. I do want to share personal experience, because obviously everybody knows that I'm a psychologist and a life coach. And of course, I've got tons of training around psychology. Are you kidding me? I know all about Freud and everybody else. And, ego is really at the center of psychology when you look at psychology. So I know a lot about it from a professional perspective. But quite frankly, is often the case, Dr. Pat, it's when it's personal that it seems to have more power and it resonates more. And, I want to share with the listeners and be very candid with the listeners about my own personal experience with ego. You can understand things intellectually and they may not hit emotionally on that emotional level. And I think going through my own personal experience made this whole concept more real. And something that I could actually kind of sink my teeth into or wrap my mind around. My own personal experience around, that kind of got me to ego, Dr. Pat, quite frankly, started at a time when I've shared with listeners before that I was really struggling. On the outside, life looked great. It looked perfect. But on the inside, I had chronic anxiety. I had chronic depression, the sense of emptiness and loneliness. And I always call it the not enoughness. The not enoughness is I'm not enough. There isn't enough. I'll never be enough. I won't have enough. And I really struggled with that. It was torturous. I'll be really frank. It was torturous. And it was torturous enough for me to look for something. Like I desperately was seeking something that would help me relieve these feelings that I was having. And I stumbled onto a practice, and it was in the spiritual world. And this is how spirituality became really important in the work that I do today, is I stumbled on a practice or concept called mindfulness. And what it did is it led me down this practice of mindfulness. So if you think about mindfulness, all mindfulness is conscious awareness, developing conscious awareness. Because when we don't have conscious awareness, what are we? We are unconscious. Unconscious means things are happening in us and that come out of us without our awareness. So mindfulness is just a pretty word that basically means practicing conscious awareness. And as I did this, Dr. Pat, what I realized that I was having the experience when I was doing these practices, I was having these experiences of there is a part of me that is separate. Like I could feel this awareness. I was aware of this awareness. I was having the feelings of anxiety, of self-criticism, of emptiness, and I could separate from it. Like I could feel the awareness and these separately. Over time, I realized how important this was. This was like, oh my gosh, this is the hammer in your toolbox, the most important, most basic tool in your toolbox. And what I did over time is I was able to take that awareness and practice neutrality. So this part of me that was observing was neutral in its observation. Why is this important? It is important because when we have neutrality, there's an air of acceptance. And when there's acceptance, there's a more willingness, a greater willingness to look at something. I know Brené Brown, talks a lot about shame. And when we have shame, we have everything in the dark. We hide it. We can't see it. And if we can't see it, we can't change it. And so the beautiful thing that I learned with this practice is when I had my neutral observer and I appreciated and valued the neutral observer, and this is a part of the ego, is the neutral observer, that I could look at the experiences I was having with no judgment, with neutrality. And in that space, I could say, okay, I'm having this experience. I now recognize that my thoughts that I am having are creating an emotional reaction. This emotional reaction results or impels or fuels a behavior. And a behavior could be withdrawal. A behavior could be, being a wallflower. A behavior could be more aggressive. It could be anger, irritability, or whatever. This was really important. This was a very important piece of the puzzle. Well, why? Why am I sharing this with you? Here's what's important about what I'm sharing. What is important about the experience I learned is that with the practice of mindfulness, I realized I was not my thoughts. I was not I wasn't my feelings. I wasn't my judgments, but I was something separate from that. And in that separation, I had the power. I found that power to change the experience I was having. Would you like to say anything about that? I'm curious. You look like you're in thought.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm thinking about, and I'm also taking some notes on it, is that how else are we going to change if we don't know what is now making us aware, what the purpose of that awareness is, right? I'm paraphrasing. What the purpose of the awareness is, whether there's an action to be done from the awareness or not. See, this is kind of the thing when we think about it, we think about our lives. So many of us grew up anxious, nervous. I mean, seriously, right? Speaking even today was difficult for me. I stuttered growing up. And so how do we get past it? You see, remember I said to you earlier, one of the greatest misconceptions about ego and personality is that it's stuck. that it is not flexible to change. And I think that's don't you think that that's part of the problem in defining it, is we think it's this static thing, and it's so far from that, because isn't everything you described a reinvention, a course correction, a reignition of things and experiences that you've learned of to move you from where you were to where you wanted to be?
Yes.
And
Yes.
could you do that? Let me ask you, could you have done that without ego?
No,
Right.
absolutely not.
Right. But that's why you're talking about it today, because so often in the empowerment language, ego is left out. It's like it's a bad thing, right? We don't put it together and say, oh, empowering ego. I mean, this is really one of the major shifts I think you're making in creating a new narrative on this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick break, and we'll talk more about this when we return. You're listening to the Empowered Living Zone with Dr. A and Dr. Pat, and we'll be right back. We are back on the Empowered Living Zone with me, Dr. A, and Dr. Pat, and we're going to continue our discussion about this ego. You know, Dr. Pat, I wanted to highlight something that you said that I thought was really important. And that is, you know, we often treat the ego as if it's if it's just a static thing, like it's the enemy that we just got to get rid of. And in reality, it's a very dynamic, changing, developing thing. You know, when I look at myself and my own personal development, my ego and how my ego shows up today is dramatically different than what it did 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So it develops just like we do. It grows just like we do. And I think that's a really important thing to recognize in this process.
It is important, and it's important in so many ways. I'm going to be doing a show later on talking about confidence. And, you know, I think when we think about the way ego is explained, it gives us a baseline. It gives us a benchmark. It allows us to take a look at an experience in life or something or someplace we're at. Because without that reference, how do we know, right? The difference between what you and I are talking about, which is in an empowered, let's just say, idea. The difference between what we're talking about is we're not telling you to take that situation and turn it into a story. And what do I mean by a story? Somebody says to you, gee, thank you, Pat, for sharing your vision, but boy, that's just your ego talking. And I'm thinking, well, is it? Well, the reality is no. You know, sometimes we get a vision from essence. Sometimes we get a vision that we're born with. Sometimes we have a great idea. I mean, do you think if everybody that has been out there saying, I have got a great idea and got criticism rolled over, we would not have gotten the Einsteins, we wouldn't have gotten the Madame Curies, we wouldn't have gotten, you understand, these people that we know of, that we talk about, that we see, do you think they got here without criticism? But what's the difference though? Dr. A, talk about the difference between you and them and what we now know about them. There's a very big difference.
There is a big difference. And I think the big difference ultimately, Dr. Pat, is that these individuals believed what was going on inside of their gut, you know, that inspiration, that direction, the creative direction, you know, that's usually, and I will be honest, that is what got me through my own life. If I didn't have that, I don't know where I would have been, because if I would have gone with the direction outside of me or the comments outside of me, where would I have ended up? And you look at the greatest, if you look at our evolution as humankind and all of the wonderful things that have been discovered, they've been discovered by people who had been criticized or been labeled as crazy. And look at where we are. And so I think that that's really important. You know, I think one of the disservices of our culture is it is chronically coming at us to question our own intuition, to question our own inner guidance. And we get to the point where we basically cut our connection from our own GPS system, so to speak, because of what we get on the outside. And I think that is so sad. It's so sad.
It is very sad. And you know what's interesting about what you just said is it's counterproductive. In a world, you know, we hear holistic, right?
Yes.
And then I think you shared an example earlier, holistic, and then you mentioned ego. And people get at odds. But isn't the very nature and definition of the word holistic all inclusive? And so I think that what you're sharing with folks today is a deep understanding of this thing we call ego and how it has been created for our benefit. Now, I'm not saying that we don't have scenarios where the ego can really bring us down. But that's the beauty of the ego. It is so multifaceted. You know what it's like? It's like watching your own action superhero movie.
Yeah.
Because it seems to have superhero power in some sense, but it can either be the hero or the villain. And you see, we don't really understand that we have the choice as to which it's going to be.
Absolutely. I think that's a great metaphor, Dr. Pat, because it's interesting when you watch any of the superhero movies, there's always the dark side, right? They always address the dark side, right? And in some ways we think about our ego as being the dark side, and we can. Our ego, I'm not going to lie, our ego can get us into trouble. It can absolutely get us into a lot of suffering when it is kind of hijacked us. And that is a real thing. And we'll talk about that in future episodes. Nonetheless, after recognizing that, if you look at the beauty of this quote machine, it's beautifully designed. It is beautifully designed. And what happens is that a lot of times people get caught up in the illusion of truth. So what I mean by that is when they don't recognize, so they believe the illusion. I am my feelings. I am my thoughts. I am what my body is doing. I am my judgments. That when they believe that that is who they are, that is the end of the game for them. There's nothing else. And they believe that this is it. This is the way it is. And that is purely an illusion. And when they recognize that our ego is a tool in our toolbox, and the experience that comes with ego. So we have lived experience that comes in, it begins in, through our senses, in our mind interprets it, our mind creates a narrative. And our ego is separate from all of that. It can watch it, it can observe that. And as you said, it can course correct, it can tinker, it can play with it. And here's the thing that we've really gotten off base with. This is supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be the fun part. Remember, I know most of us can't remember being children. When we're really young, if you watch a baby, if you watch a toddler, you watch them experiment with cause and effect. What happens when I drop the food off the high chair? Oh, mom gets upset or mom puts it back on. Oh, and if I do it again, there's no attachment to it. There's no identification with it. It's just curiosity and testing. And we've lost that as adults. We take things way too seriously and we make everything very the truth, and it's really not. And when we can get perspective and recognize, oh, all of this stuff, they're just tools that help me with this process. My thoughts, my narratives, my emotions, my judgments, those are just tools. And I can use those to go in directions that I want to go. And it's all about course correction. It's all about cause and effect. It's a loop. It's a feedback loop. If I'm not feeling good about something, change the direction, change the narrative. It's that simple. Yeah. And a lot of people don't realize that. They don't realize that it's that simple.
Somebody asked me a question, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago. I can't even remember the context of it, but the question was about the ego. And they asked me, what do you think the ego loves best in a modern day society that we live in today? And my answer, just right at multitasking. I said, the ego loves multitasking. And they looked at me, and certainly there wasn't enough time to explain it. And they just looked at me and almost with why. And I said, well, think about it. Multitasking is the fuel by which we keep going, and going so that we never really stop. And we've created a tool that allows us to be in human doing most of the time of our life instead of human being. And sometimes the ego likes that. It's not that it's bad, but the ego is simply giving you what you want. You want to keep up. And the ego loves to really serve you in that way. Although multitasking may be great to do, all of us have to do it. However, there are times when you just have to put it down, where you just have to hit the pause button. And the ego is also a great reminder to show us that part too. You see, we will know when we're almost on the verge of boiling to the point of literally hot dogs in a pot, okay? That's where we are. And don't you find that if we are, like you said, aware, conscious, that we will get messages that could maybe even save our lives, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I know we're getting close to ending here, and I think that's something that's really important to highlight, is to highlight our ego is our friend. And can our ego hijack us? Absolutely. Because why? What's the second job of the ego? The second job of the ego is to maintain well-being and safety. And sometimes it gets a little crazy in terms of what it interprets as unsafe. And so it can get caught up in that. And you're talking about the multitasking. Multitasking is about safety. It's really about, am I okay? Am I okay? So if I get all these things done, I'm a wonderful human being and everybody's going to like me and I'm going to be great. This is what's going on in our ego mind. And to recognize, we've got to keep that in check. It's its job, but we want to make sure that the ego isn't running the show. The ego is in service with our higher truth. Our ego is in service with our purpose in life. And when our ego is healthy and well balanced, it's part of that picture of wholeness. Wholeness is not just our spirit. Wholeness is our humanness. And our imperfections and our learning and trial and error and our suffering, all of that is part of our wholeness. And it's all part of the package. And it's all what we're gifted with to navigate this world in a purposeful and powerful way.
Yeah. And that's really, for what I see, that's the next step for you. You've created a platform for people to step into an energetic field that allows them to really fully embrace and understand what empowered is and empowered living. And these shows you're doing are both educational, they're fun, and they take people to a place which gives them the opportunity to explore maybe a place they've never gone before.
Yes, that's my hope. That's my goal. Thank you. All right. I know we're coming to an end here. Stay tuned for the next podcast of the Empowered Living Zone, where we will be discussing how the ego can get in the way of self-empowerment. We will share some anecdotes and some golden nuggets. I look forward to sharing more with you. Before we end today, once again, if you would like to contact me or learn more about empowered living and psychospiritual transformational life coaching, contact me through my website at www.empoweredlivingcoaching.com. I want to thank Dr. Pat for being an inspiring partner. Thank you to all of my listeners for tuning into the Empowered Living Zone. As always, I had a great time. Please join me every first and third Tuesday of the month at 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time. Thank you for tuning in to the Empowered Living Zone show with me, Dr. A, to create the life you crave. Tune in on the first and third Tuesdays at noon Pacific time on transformationtalkradio.com and get ready for another show. Say yes to creating positive and empowering change in your life and move beyond life's challenging terrain into the zone of success. Be ignited by spirit, fueled by purpose, and guided by vision in the Empowered Living Zone. For more information on how to do deep transformational work with me and to create the life you crave, visit empoweredlivingcoaching.com. That's empoweredlivingcoaching.com. See you next time.